Hello students and welcome to the second part of our food law presentation. This is our last presentation of this course and we're going to talk about food law in the international setting. So the learning objectives for today are to discuss international regulations, to describe private standards, to explain organic standards, and to discuss GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So a quick recap about our last presentation. The USDA in 1862 was created. The Federal Meat Inspection Act was passed in 1907, and the Poultry Product Inspection Act in 1957. FDA was created in 1938, and by 1960, half of the US supply was subject to FDA standards. Between 1945 and 1948, the UN, the FAO, and the World Health Organization were created. And this is very important because from the FAO and the WHO, the Codex Alimentarius will be created, and this is one of the standards in international regulations that we will see in a couple of slides. So regarding international regulations, we have UN nations here in 1945 created the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. First session was in 1945, and then we have the World Health Organization enter into force 1948. These two entities, FAO and the WHO, created jointly what we know as the Codex Alimentarius, and this means food code in Latin. And this is it's based in Europe. Normally, it will do sessions in Italy and Switzerland. Or some countries in Europe, and the Codex Alimentarius is one of the standards for regulations. So if you are not able to find, say, the standard of identity of your product in FDA, you can look in the Codex Alimentarius, and for sure you will find the Codex Alimentarius standard. Many countries, most of the countries are part of the Codex Alimentarius, and this helps have internationally standardized regulations and homogenization of these regulations. So many countries adopt many of the Codex standards as well as FDA or USDA standards. So the Codex Alimentarius works both with nutrition and labeling, and it contains guidelines for different aspects like hygienic practice, labeling, additives, inspection or certification, nutrition and residues of veterinary drugs and pesticides. So the Codex Alimentarius has many different committees which are specialized in these activities, and also it has specific committees based on types of food, like for example the Committee of Fruits and Vegetables, the Committee of Dairy, Committee say meat. So there's many types of committees very specific to types of food, and there's also committees related with labeling or additives or inspection and so we can have, for example, if you look in the codex, you can find standards for food, like say a general standard for fruit juices and nectars, and the general standard for honey. And what you will find in the standard is all the regulations related with what will make a fruit juice be called fruit juice, what's the percentage of fruit, percentage of solids or sugars, what would you call a nectar, what are the type of analysis that you need to use to make sure that you're measuring these concentrations, for example, how are you going to process these type of products, packaging, etc. So there's many different standards in terms of both composition, processing, safety, and so that are described in this type of standards. So again, if you are not sure about standard, you cannot find it in the FDA website. You can look at the Codex Alimentarius website. So where are we today in this international setting? So I encourage you to take a look at these trade and food safety standards. And this page talks about the impacts of COVID-19, the supply chain and raw material sourcing. As we may recall, during COVID, the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure in the food supply chains, and we were faced with a lot of challenges, both locally, nationally, but also in the international setting. As we know, today we are in a global economy, a global world, so many of the raw materials we consume may come from different parts of the world. And all of these transportation at the end is logistics and supply chain. So we had many challenges, and we had to adapt the new regulations and new practices to make sure that we have a supply of raw materials, and that, of course, with all these wars, problems in the world, there's also shortage of some foods, for example, wheat, and this, of course, impacts many of the supply chains in the US and in the world. And how are we going to deal with all these problems, and what are the measures that companies and government are going to take to make sure that we have the products that we need? Of course, you guys know that when there's a shortage of something, prices will go up because there's a lot of demand, and the offer is limited. So prices will go up. So there's a lot of regulations that have to be put in place for this type of problems. So as I mentioned before, the US has its own regulations, but in the international setting, there's a lot of negotiation that has to be done, and many of the trade and food safety standards are shared around the world. So are FDA and USDA involved with Codex? Yeah, for sure. US is one of the most important members of Codex, as it has a very large economy and a lot of influence in the decisions that are made by Codex. So FDA, of course, is concerned about consumer protection, food safety and labeling, prevention of economic fraud. As I mentioned, each country has its own regulations for, let's say, labeling. And if you want, for example, to import something to the US or to export something to other countries, you have to comply with the new country's regulations in terms of food labeling. Sometimes there's things that are shared or that are standardized, but others that are different. So let's say, for example, regulations in the US and Mexico are very different, although many of the regulations from Mexico are based on US or FDA standards. The nutritional labeling, for example, in terms of the nutrition facts has some differences, maybe not in, well, maybe a little bit in the format, but more in what we call the alert seals that will have a product, for example, high in sodium or high in saturated fats, high in sugars. They will have seals that are in an octagonal shape, and you can see that, but that's another story, and that those are the regulations. And in many countries of Latin America, we have this type of seals or preventive alerts for consumers. The US is looking for something similar. There's still law projects that are going to be revised, but yeah, it's important to consider that even when we have specific regulations, we also share other regulations with the world and the global economy. USDA does international outreach and education with many of the low-income countries, and it's very concerned about sustainability and nutrition. So of course the USDA is involved with international regulations. So what is a private standard? As we mentioned before, many of the regulations are established by government in order to set up a common ground to have standards that are shared by manufacturers. But sometimes industry will have private standards, and these are standards that are designed by non-governmental entities. It can be industry sectors, associations. So they find the need to have regulations, maybe to protect their brands, to protect a new product, to protect a patent or something. And that's the idea. Why would private industry step in? Because as we know, industry moves at a faster pace, and as compared, for example, with government regulations, and maybe there's a need for something for protection of specific product or a specific process. So that's why there's, of course, as you guys know, there's a lot of competition, global economy. So sometimes industries will come together, industry sectors or associations or councils, and then they will propose what we call private standards. What are the drivers of establishing private standards? So assignment of legal responsibility to food chain operators for ensuring food safety, clarity among increasing global and complex supply chains, increasing consumer awareness of food, food systems, and impact on health. So these are needs and drivers that will make companies, manufacturer sectors, or associations come together and promote these standards. Some examples of private standards are the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, which is an organization that has many food quality systems. Here's an example for food safety, but there's other ISO standards for like lab management, sustainability, management of waste management, and so. Another example will be fair trade, which is to promote the uniform application of fair trade practices. And this is mainly in the sourcing of raw materials. For example, many of like coffee, tea, things that have a high value, and the processing is not as complex. Then we can have things like fair trade, which applies to food, but also to other things like crafts and so. What are the advantages of private standards? So why would companies, for example, look for private standards or do all the process of getting a private standard? Because it will give them a competitive edge, provide added value and consistency, will give them an advantage with buyers, provide transparency, and it's also fast acting when it's right. Like I mentioned, sometimes industry moves at a faster pace than government, and that's why private standards are important. The drawbacks of private standards will be like compliance cost. To have a certification, for example, an ISO certification or a fair trade certification, you have to comply, do a lot of like documentation. Sometimes it implies visits to your company, manufacturing company, etc. There's a lot of time, input time, cost, human capital that has to go into this, so it's an important investment. There's also higher burden on supply chains, because when you have when you require these types of certifications of fair trade, and so also because you have to comply with specific standards, you also want your suppliers to have these standards. So that also implies that your suppliers have to comply with these standards. Let's say an example, Coca-Cola has specific standards for peach nectar, for example, or peach juice. So if they're going to buy from X or Y suppliers, the suppliers have to comply with their standards, because Coca-Cola has specific standards in terms of quality, and maybe these standards are better than the government standards. So the suppliers have also to comply. Also, we may have export challenges because of all the requirements that we're talking about, and competition. Of course, there's a lot of competition in terms of acquiring or obtaining these certifications, and also keeping these certifications, and also the cost that it involves. Sometimes some regulations have started as private, and then they migrate to a government level, and they go into regulation. Like, for example, organic standards, they started as private standards, and then there were national voluntary standards, and which were in line with Codex guidelines, and then they became part of the USDA, and now we have the USDA organic certification, which is, I recommend that you guys watch and see these fact sheets. And this is a certification where the USDA will certify a production facility or a agricultural facility for being USDA organic. And sometimes you will see seals of like USDA organic or 90% organic, meaning like 90% of the ingredients are of organic source, and then 10% are not, and some type of percentages like that. So here are two fact sheets. One is a brief overview of the history and philosophy of organic agriculture, and the other is what is organic. And this is something that is driven by consumers' needs, consumers' want, and there's of course controversy about organic being good or not, and it depends of course on where are you located, like the income you have. And so for example, maybe for some people here in the US, it's very important for something to be organic, because as we know, organic maybe it's free of pesticides and so, but maybe some people that live, for example, in Africa, they really don't care about that. They really care about eating because they're hungry, right? So the priorities change depending on the settings, and that's important to consider, that the reality that we live, for example, in California, it's maybe not the same as other parts of the US, and it's of course not the same as other parts of the world. So something that may be so important here in the US as organic, maybe it's not as important in other parts of the world, or it's more like a niche market, and those are things that we have to consider. And well, in one of the last things that I want to talk about is GMOs. So GMOs are genetically modified organisms, and I encourage you to watch this video about test tube tomato. So GMOs, this topic has a lot of controversy, but GMOs is really something that is naturally done. So when we call about like breeding or crossbreeding, when we have, for example, one tomato variety, and then we have that has, for example, a nice color, and then we have another tomato variety that has a sweet flavor, something like that. So in nature, or in reality, there's breeding or crossbreeding, and then farmers will combine these two tomatoes and get something that is better. So GMOs is basically working across different organisms and finding traits in one organism that can be applied to another. As we know, bacteria, microorganisms, and yeast, they multiply very fast. So if you find something, for example, a trait that makes, I don't know, a crop resistant to heavy rainfall, or resistant to droughts, or resistant to specific type of pesticide, then you will apply this trait to a specific crop. So that's how you're modifying the organism genetically. So you are making or changing some part of the genome to make this new plant resistant to specific things. And these are genetically modified organisms. Of course, there's this controversy about how this affects the native species or endemic species or the environment, and so, but that's another different subject. But at the beginning, GMOs were accepted by consumers because they were labeled as GMOs, and of course, you can get advantages of GMOs. And GMOs is a little bit related also with biotechnology. Many things that we have, for example, like insulin, are GMOs, and or was created by GMO technology. And many things that we have, advances in technology and that we have today, are based on this GMO or principle. So of course I understand there's a lot of like certification on GMO and so, but many things in food, as you may have seen to now, is very related with marketing, about what people think. And so from a scientific perspective, there's of course pros and cons from GMOs, but sometimes it's something that is a need, and then depending on the end goal, you will see that it's not as bad. So if you guys remember the plant-based burgers, they are using this heme pigment, so that's genetically modified because they're using a gene from a soybean plant that produces this pigment, and they're reproducing this in with biotechnology, and then this is very fast, and then they are applying this to like meat products. So yeah, the important take-home message is that nothing in food is really good, 100% good or 100% bad. There's always this middle ground, and that we have to be very critical on what we hear and what really is bad, or what really is more like bad press and things like that. So in terms of science, GMO is something that is being done, and that will continue to be done because it's important. And I understand some labels like non-GMO and so, but that's because consumers want it, and not really because it has something bad. So, and if you have more like questions also and so about GMOs, please feel free to reach out. And the questions are: who are the international regulators and what is their role? How does the FDA and USDA work with these regulators? What is a private standard? Provide examples of private standards, advantages and disadvantages. How did the USDA organic program evolve to a regulation? And finally, what's your opinion and perspective on GMOs? So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And it was very nice having you this summer in FSN 319. See you next time.